This is a personal story about an unnatural experience while working in a nursing home. The nursing home is located in a small town in Romania. In this story, I will not tell the actual location or my name, while people around me will think I'm crazy. As a college student, working in a nursing home was an excellent way to make some extra money, but this particular experience made me quit the job. It was a typical Friday night, and I was gearing up for another shift at the nursing home where I worked part-time. The nursing home was a sprawling, centuries-old building with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways that always seemed to be shrouded in shadows. As I arrived at the nursing home, I noticed something strange. An eerie silence permeated the building as if the walls held their breath. The air felt dense and suffocating, and I couldn't quite place why, but I had an uneasy feeling as I walked through the halls to begin my shift. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. As I made my rounds, checking on the patients, I came to Mrs. Jenkins' room. Mrs. Jenkins was a sweet old lady who had been at the nursing home for years. She always had a kind smile on her face and was loved by all the staff. But something was different about her tonight. As I walked into her room, I saw her sitting in bed, staring at me with a wide smile. Her eyes seemed to be glinting in the dim light of the room, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hello there, dearie," she said in a strangely high-pitched voice. "Hello, Mrs. Jenkins," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is everything okay?" "Oh yes, everything's just fine," she replied, still smiling that creepy smile. "I'm just so happy to see you." I couldn't help but feel like her smile was fake, like she was trying to hide something behind it. The way she spoke was also unsettling, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I quickly finished my rounds and left her room, feeling uneasy. Before we continue with this story, do you want to know a secret? Our team of story writers know the best horror stories out there. If you like this story and want to support us, leave a like. Let's continue with the story. Sitting at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. But then, I remembered a story I had heard earlier that day from a friend. It was a story about a paranormal experience where a girl from our town saw a smiling man in a corner of her room at night. I brushed it off as just a coincidence, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger as the night went on. Every time I walked past Mrs. Jenkins' room, I could feel her eyes following me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go back into her room to check on her. As I walked in, I saw that her smile had grown even wider. However, her eyes seemed very dark, so I almost couldn't see the white of her eye, which gave me a thrilling sense of fear. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Jenkins?" I asked, trying to hide my fear. "Oh yes, sweetheart," she replied. "Everything's just perfect." I tried to leave the room, but she grabbed my hand surprisingly. Her grip was cold and clammy, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Stay with me," she said, her voice growing more urgent. "Don't leave me alone." I tried to pull away, but her grip only grew tighter. I could feel her nails digging into my skin, and I realized that there was something seriously wrong with her. As I struggled to break free, I felt something brush against my ankle. I looked down and saw a small, wrinkled hand reaching out from under the bed. I screamed and ran out of the room, my heart racing with fear. I knew that something was terribly wrong at the nursing home, but I didn't know what to do. The next day, I decided to tell my supervisor about what had happened. But when I described Mrs. Jenkins' creepy smile and the hand that had reached out from under the bed, my supervisor just looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no one at the nursing home named Mrs. Jenkins," she said, "and there haven't been any reports of strange occurrences." I was stunned. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't believe what my supervisor had just told me. I was sure that Mrs. Jenkins was a real person and that something was seriously wrong at the nursing home. As I left my supervisor's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I felt like every step I took was being monitored, and that whoever or whatever was behind this was trying to scare me. I decided to do some digging of my own. I spent hours poring over the nursing home's records, trying to find any mention of Mrs. Jenkins, but there was nothing. No one by that name had ever been a patient at the nursing home. As I was about to give up, I stumbled across an old newspaper article from decades ago. It was a story about a nursing home that had been shut down after reports of abuse and neglect. The nursing home had been run by a woman named Mrs. Jenkins, who had been accused of mistreating her patients. The article sent shivers down my spine. Could it be that the ghost of Mrs. Jenkins was haunting the nursing home, seeking revenge on those who had wronged her? I decided to go back to the nursing home that night, armed with my phone camera. I was determined to catch any evidence of the ghostly presence that I was sure was haunting the halls. As I made my way through the darkened halls, I heard strange noises coming from Mrs. Jenkins' old room. I hesitated for a moment, but then my curiosity got the best of me, and I crept closer. I peered through the crack in the door and saw something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Jenkins was sitting up in bed, smiling her creepy smile, but she wasn't alone this time. There were dozens of other patients in the room, all of them with the same creepy smile on their faces. I realized that I had stumbled upon something much bigger than I had ever imagined. There was some dark energy at work here, and I had to put a stop to it. I slowly opened the door and stepped into the room. As soon as I did, the patients looked at me with creepy smiles. "What is this? Just stop being creepy," I said, trying to sound brave. But Mrs. Jenkins and the other patients just laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. They started to close in on me, their creepy smiles growing wider and wider. I knew I had to act fast. I pulled out my phone and started recording, hoping to capture some evidence of what was happening. As I held up my phone, a blinding light filled the room. I felt a force pushing me backward, and I stumbled out of the room. When I looked back, the room was empty. There was no sign of Mrs. Jenkins or the other patients. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something that I was never meant to see. Mrs. Jenkins was real, but why did she haunt me in the nursing room? And that's why I'm writing this story now on Reddit. I still feel like something is wrong with Mrs. Jenkins, and her creepy smile still haunts me. I need to know what happened that night, and if anyone else has had a similar experience. And it's not just in my mind. Strange things have been happening around me since that night. Objects move on their own, doors slam shut for no reason, and I hear whispers when I'm alone. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't help feeling like Mrs. Jenkins is still out there for some reason. And every time I feel this, I think, if Mrs. Jenkins is out there, what other dark forces are at work in the world around us? And how can we ever hope to protect ourselves from them? By sharing my story, I hope to find some